The first thing you heard on Abram's land was the sound. It wasn't the lowing of cattle or the nicker of a horse, but a frantic, rattling chatter, 127 tiny alarms all going off at once. It was the sound of his folly, the thing that had made him the quiet joke of the whole valley for 2 years. Now, it was the only sound of real life for miles. From his porch, Abram watched the dust plume rising from the valley road, a solitary signal in the suffocating stillness of a drought-stricken afternoon. His German shepherd, Bauer, lay at his feet, head on his paws, but his ears twitched, tracking the approaching buggy. The dog didn't growl. Nothing that came up this road was a threat anymore. The threat was already here, in the grass, in the soil, clinging to every living thing except what was on this patch of hard-won ground. Abram ran a callous thumb over the worn wood of the porch rail. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the parched land until the air itself seemed to shimmer and warp. Beyond his fence line, the world was painted in shades of brittle brown and exhausted gray. His neighbors' fields were silent. The cattle that remained stood hunched and miserable, heads low, too sick to even switch their tails at the buzzing flies. But on his side of the fence, there was motion. A tide of speckled gray and white, a flowing, pecking, scratching army that moved with a singular, relentless purpose. His Guinea hens. They surged through the dry grass in waves, their helmeted heads bobbing, their sharp eyes missing nothing. They were the source of the noise, the source of the mockery, and now, the source of this pilgrimage. The buggy finally pulled up to his gate. It was a fine one, polished black with yellow-spoked wheels, but the horse between the shafts was lathered and thin, its coat dull with the dust and the sickness. Mr. Corwin sat holding the reins, a man whose wealth was measured in acres and head of cattle, a man who had never once in his life had to ask for anything from a man like Abram. He didn't get out. He just sat there, his fine suit looking out of place in the grim reality of the day, his face a mask of pride so cracked and brittle it looked like it might shatter. He stared past Abram, at the flock of strange, noisy birds that patrolled the land like sentinels. He was listening to the sound. The sound of his own ruin, and Abram's impossible, ridiculous salvation. It had started 2 years before with a different kind of silence, the silence of a new grave. After his father passed, Abram was left with nothing but 160 acres of the valley's poorest land and a dog that was more bone than bark at the time. The soil was thin and rocky, the creek dried to a muddy trickle by mid-July, and the grass was more weed than fodder. His neighbors, men like Corwin who owned the lush bottomlands, looked at Abram's inheritance with a kind of pity that felt sharper than scorn. It wasn't a ranch, it was a penance. He'd spent the first few months in a daze of grief and hard labor, mending fences that barely seemed worth the effort, hauling water until his back screamed, and tallying his losses in a little ledger in his head. Every day felt like a step backward. He was 30 years old and felt ancient, weathered down by the sheer stubbornness of the land he was supposed to tame. Then, a traveling merchant, his wagon loaded with all manner of tonics, tools, and trifles, had stopped for water. In the back of the wagon was a large, slatted crate filled with the strangest birds Abram had ever seen. They had dark, speckled bodies like a star-filled night sky, and bald, blue heads with a horny little knob on top. They didn't cluck like chickens, they shrieked, a sound like a rusty gate being forced open again and again. Guinea fowl, the merchant had said, wiping his brow. Fresh from the east. Hardy birds. Eat anything. Bugs, snakes, you name it. A man in the next territory lost his nerve. Selling them for a song, Abram didn't have money for a song. He had just enough for a whisper. He looked at the birds, at their frantic, unsettling energy. He looked at his own land, plagued by grasshoppers in the spring and crawling with things he couldn't see in the summer. He had 2 good cows to his name and a dog to feed. Something had to give. He traded the merchant a spare saddle, his father's last good one, for the whole lot. 127 of them. The merchant laughed as he pocketed the extra coin Abram threw in. Lord help you with that noise, son. When he uncrated them, it was chaos. They exploded into the yard, a screeching, scattering mob, and for a moment, Abram felt a profound and certain sense of having made the worst mistake of his life. Bauer, just a pup then, barked himself hoarse, utterly bewildered by the screeching invaders. They weren't livestock. They were a plague of noise, a feathered madness he had just willingly invited onto his last hope. For a month, Abram fought them. He tried to herd them like chickens, but they refused to be herded. They flew into the low branches of the scrub oaks, roosting 30 feet in the air. They ignored the feed he scattered, preferring to range far and wide, disappearing into the brush for hours only to return at dusk in a chaotic, chattering flood. They were wild, untamable. He was near to wringing all their necks just for a moment of peace when an old man appeared at his fence line one evening. He was a trapper. Folks called him Old Man Hemlock, a man who spoke with an accent thick as molasses, a relic from some European forest transplanted into the harsh sun of the West. He rarely came to town and was said to know the land better than any map. He stood there for a long time, leaning on a gnarled walking stick, just watching the guineas pour back into the yard for the night. Abram walked over, ready for another dose of pity or advice he couldn't use. The old man didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on the birds. "They make a man's ears bleed, J." Hemlock said, his voice a low rumble. "I reckon they do," Abram admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "Can't get a handle on them." "Worst trade I ever made." Hemlock finally turned his pale blue eyes to Abram. They were startlingly clear, like ice. He pointed a crooked finger at the flock, which was now moving with a strange, unified purpose across the yard, pecking and scratching at the ground with unnerving intensity. "You think you are the farmer," Hemlock said slowly, his words heavy with thought. "You think you must bend the creature to the land. This is wrong. You listen. You watch." Die Erdahat Eigen and Asti. He saw the confusion on Abram's face and clarified, his accent softening the sharp edges of the words. "The earth has its own doctors. You must only learn to see the cure it offers, not the one you demand." And with that, he nodded once, a curt, final gesture, and walked away, melting back into the twilight as quietly as he had appeared. Abram stood there long after the old man was gone, the strange words echoing in his head. The earth has its own doctors. He looked at the shrieking, frantic, impossible birds not as a failed crop of chickens, but as something else entirely. He stopped trying to manage them. He started to watch. He began to see them not as a chaotic mob, but as a disciplined force. They rose with the sun, not waiting for him, and moved out from the homestead in a wide, sweeping line, a living dragnet. They combed through the grass, their heads down, their focus absolute. He saw them devour grasshoppers, beetles, and spiders with a terrifying efficiency. He watched one snatch a small snake from the dust and swallow it whole. They were not grazers, they were hunters. Their constant, grating chatter wasn't random noise, it was communication, a network of signals that kept the flock together and alerted them to the slightest threat. If a hawk circled overhead, a specific, piercing cry would send every bird scrambling for cover. They were a self-governing, self-protecting society that asked nothing of him but the space to do their work. Bauer learned their ways, too. The dog stopped seeing them as intruders and began treating them as part of the ranch's ecosystem, a strange, feathered herd he was duty-bound to watch over. He would trot along the edge of the flock, a silent, furry shepherd to a congregation of screeching birds. The mockery from his neighbors started that first summer. Riders would stop at his fence, listen for a moment to the unholy racket, and shake their heads. "Sounds like a madhouse over here, Abram," one would call out, laughing. It became a local joke. Abram's folly. Abram's screeching chickens. Mr. Corwin was the most cutting, his condescension masked in polite concern. He stopped by one afternoon, ostensibly to check on a shared stretch of fence. "Abram," he'd said, his voice smooth as butter, "a man's reputation is tied to the sound of his land. The sound of healthy cattle, the peace of a well-run operation. What you have here, it's an unsettling noise. It speaks of desperation." Abram had just nodded, his hands busy with a piece of leather harness. "They keep the bugs down," he'd said, not looking up. Corwin had chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. "My boy, there are proper ways to manage pests. Chemicals. Controlled burns. Not this." He gestured vaguely at the chattering flock. A man can't build a legacy on a foundation of noise and nonsense. Abram didn't argue. He just kept his head down and let the guineas work. He was keeping his own ledger. Less flies on his 2 cows. Fewer pests in his small vegetable garden. He was learning to listen past the noise and hear the quiet hum of a healthier piece of land underneath. The next year, the rains were stingy. Spring was a brief splash of green that faded almost as soon as it arrived. By June, the sun was a merciless hammer, and the land grew brittle. The creeks shrank, and the Great Plains, usually rolling with grass tall enough to hide a calf, were stunted and pale. With the heat and the dryness came a silence that felt heavy and wrong. The bird song was thinner, the coyotes howled less at night. It was a watchful, waiting stillness, the kind that precedes a storm or a sickness. And with the stillness came the ticks. It started subtly. Abram would find them on Bower after the dog had ranged out, tiny black specks that grew into fat, grey pearls. He'd pull them off, one by one, dropping them into a jar of kerosene. At first, there were a few. Then a dozen. Then too many to count. He checked his own cattle daily, his heart in his throat, but they remained clean. He realized why one sweltering afternoon, while watching the guineas forage near the fence line. They weren't just eating grasshoppers. They were eating ticks. They moved through the tall grass with the precision of surgeons, their sharp eyes spotting the questing parasites on the tips of blades. Peck, peck, peck. They were systematically cleansing his pasture, devouring the tiny vampires before they could ever find a host. He began to understand Old Man Hemlock's words on a deeper level. The guineas weren't just a cure, they were an immune system for the land itself. They were the doctors, and their work was tireless and unseen by anyone who couldn't be bothered to look closely. The ledger in his mind began to fill with new entries. Gain, 2 healthy cows. Gain, 1 healthy dog. Gain, peace of mind. Meanwhile, the talk in town was shifting. Men at the general store spoke in low, worried tones about tick fever. A few calves had been lost over on the Miller place. Corwin's ranch hands were complaining about the cattle being agitated and losing weight. They were spending a fortune on chemical dips and powders that seemed to do little more than stain the animals' hides and poison the water troughs. Abram listened quietly, buying his flour and salt, and said nothing. The dramatic irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. The very men who had mocked his unsettling noise were now living in a truly unsettling silence, the silence of creeping disease, while his own land rattled and shrieked with vibrant, pest-devouring life. By August, the valley was in the grip of a full-blown crisis. The tick outbreak was a slow, creeping plague, and the fever it carried was devastating. Cattle that were strong and hale one week were dead the next. The air, once filled with the sound of healthy herds, was now punctuated by the groans of sick animals and the grim, rhythmic thud of shovels digging burial pits. The drought had weakened the herds, and the ticks were finishing the job. Panic began to set in. Men who had built their lives and fortunes on livestock were watching their legacies wither and die in the sun-scorched grass. Their pride, once as vast as their acreage, began to shrink. They grew gaunt with worry, their eyes scanning their own pastures with a desperate, helpless gaze. Mr. Corwin was hit the hardest. His prize-winning bull, a behemoth of muscle and breeding worth more than Abram's entire property, was the first of his main herd to fall ill. Corwin spared no expense, bringing in a veterinarian from 2 counties over, a man with a fancy leather bag and fancier theories. They drenched the bull in concoctions, forced foul-smelling tonics down its throat, and kept a constant vigil. But the fever held. The bull, a creature of immense power, was reduced to a trembling, hollow-eyed wreck. Abram heard the news and felt a cold knot in his stomach. He wasn't glad for Corwin's misfortune, but he couldn't escape the terrible rightness of it. Corwin had preached about the proper ways to manage land, ways that involved money and dominance. He had tried to purchase a solution, to command the sickness to leave. But the sickness didn't care about his wealth. It was a problem of the earth, and it demanded an answer from the earth. Abram's 2 cows, by contrast, were fat and slick. His pasture, though dry, was clean. The Guineas patrolled their territory with an unflagging energy, a speckled grey army holding the line against an invisible invasion. The sound of their chattering, once a symbol of his poverty and strangeness, was now an audible declaration of health. It was a shield of noise that kept the silence of death at bay. The contrast was too stark to ignore. The tide of opinion in the valley was beginning to turn. The laughter had long since died, replaced by furtive, questioning glances in his direction whenever he came to town. The first to come was a man named Peterson, a small-time rancher whose land bordered Abrams to the north. He arrived at dusk, his hat held in both hands, twisting the brim until the felt was nearly worn through. He stood by the gate for a full minute before Abram came out onto the porch. Bauer got to his feet but didn't bark, sensing the man's posture of defeat. "Abram," Peterson began, his voice raspy. "Lord knows I ain't been the kindest neighbor to you. I've had my laugh about your birds." He swallowed hard, the sound loud in the evening quiet. "I lost 2 heifers this week. My milk cow's down with the fever now. I'm ruined if I lose her." He finally looked up, his eyes pleading. They say your birds eat the ticks. That your land is clean." Abram just watched him, his face unreadable. He remembered Peterson calling out, still running that bird asylum, Abram, just a few months prior. "They do their work," Abram said simply. Peterson took a hesitant step forward. Could I borrow some of them? Just a dozen, maybe. Just for a week or 2, to clean out my home pasture. I'll pay you. Anything you ask." This was the moment. The turning point. Abram could have savored it, could have reminded Peterson of his mockery. But looking at the man's desperate face, he saw not an enemy, but a neighbor on the brink of losing everything, just as he himself had been 2 years ago. He thought of Old Man Hemlock. "The cure the earth offers, not the one you demand." The guineas weren't his to hoard. They were the valley's doctors, he was just the one who'd been smart enough to listen to them first. "You can't borrow them," Abram said, and he saw Peterson's face fall. "They don't herd. They'd just come home. But I can sell you a starter flock. 10 hens, 2 cocks. They'll get to work right away. And you don't pay me in cash. You owe me 1 healthy calf from your next birthing season." Peterson's eyes widened, first in surprise, then in a flood of grateful relief. It was a bargain of immense fairness, an offer of partnership, not predation. "Done," Peterson breathed. "Abram, I'm in your debt." After Peterson, others followed. They came in a slow, humbled trickle, men who had once laughed openly now speaking in quiet, respectful tones. Abram made the same deal with each of them. A small flock for the promise of a future calf. His ledger of the mind began to fill with a new kind of wealth, not of coin, but of community, of debts owed in the currency of life and livestock. He was no longer the valley's fool. He was becoming its reluctant, unlikely banker. The public confrontation happened, as it had to, at the center of their small world, the feed store. Abram was loading a sack of grain into his wagon when Mr. Corwin's fine buggy pulled up. Corwin's prize bull had died the day before, and the man looked like a ghost, his face pale and drawn, his usual air of authority replaced by a simmering, impotent rage. He strode directly toward Abram, his boots kicking up dust. Several other ranchers who were present stopped their conversations, sensing a storm about to break. "You," Corwin spat, his voice shaking. "This is your doing." Abram slowly turned, resting a hand on the edge of the wagon bed. Bauer, sitting nearby, let out a low, rumbling growl from deep in his chest. "I reckon the ticks are the ones doing it, Mr. Corwin," Abram said, his voice even. "Don't play the fool with me," Corwin snapped, his voice rising. "You've been harboring this cure. These wretched birds. You watched us all get sick, watched our herds die, just waiting for us to come crawling to you, didn't you? You're profiting from our misery." He was projecting, accusing Abram of the same predatory instinct that had guided his own life. But the accusation fell flat. Peterson, who was standing nearby, stepped forward. "That ain't fair, Corwin," he said, his voice steady. "Abram didn't come to us. We went to him. He asked for a fair price, a future price. He's helping us, another rancher chimed in. My pasture's already cleaner than it's been in a year. The birds work. It ain't witchcraft, it's just nature. Nature you were too proud to see. Corwin looked around, his eyes wild, seeing that the audience he had intended to sway was already allied against him. His power, built on land and money, was useless here. The currency had changed. The new coin of the realm was practical wisdom, something he had none of. He's a charlatan, Corwin insisted, pointing a trembling finger at Abram. Selling noisy, useless birds as some kind of miracle. Abram finally straightened up from his wagon, his gaze calm and direct. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. They're not a miracle, Mr. Corwin, he said, and the quiet authority in his voice silenced the whole yard. They're just doing the job God gave them. The earth has its own doctors. A man's only job is to be quiet enough to hear their instructions. He had paraphrased Old Man Hemlock's words, and in the dusty quiet of the feed store yard, they landed with the weight of scripture. Corwin stood there, his mouth open, his own words having undone him completely. He had tried to frame Abram as a greedy opportunist, but had only succeeded in revealing his own arrogance and ignorance. Defeated and utterly alone, he turned without another word, climbed into his buggy, and rattled away, a man diminished in the eyes of the entire community he once ruled. In the months that followed, the valley began to heal. The rains returned in the autumn, soft and steady, washing the dust from the air and coaxing a shy green from the exhausted soil. But the real change wasn't in the weather, it was in the soundscape. From dawn till dusk, a new chorus echoed between the hills. The frantic, rattling chatter of guinea fowl, once confined to Abram's land, could now be heard from a half-dozen ranches. It was the sound of recovery, the sound of a lesson learned the hard way. The flocks, descendants of Abram's original 127, patrolled new pastures, a speckled militia waging a relentless war on the tick population. The cattle fever receded, and the herds, though smaller, began to regain their strength. Abram was a changed man, not in his nature, but in his standing. He was no longer Abram the fool, the outsider. He was Abram the provider, the wise one. His neighbors treated him with a deep and abiding respect. They stopped to ask his opinion not just on guineas, but on water conservation, on fencing, on reading the signs of the land. He had become the very thing Corwin accused him of being, a man of influence, but his influence was earned through patience and observation, not bought with coin. The following spring, the calves were born, and his neighbors made good on their debts. One by one, they led healthy, sturdy young animals to his gate. His own small herd swelled. The ledger in his mind, once a grim accounting of loss, was now overflowing with assets. He tallied them not just as heads of cattle, but as promises kept, as a community stitched back together. He had more than he had ever started with, yet he had sold nothing of real value. He had simply shared the cure the earth had offered. Even Mr. Corwin's land began to change. After a long, prideful silence, Corwin had sent a ranch hand to buy a flock of guineas from Peterson, unable to bring himself to face Abram directly. The sound of the birds eventually drifted over from Corwin's vast acreage, a grudging admission of defeat and a quiet testament to the power of a simple, natural truth. Abram would stand on his porch in the evenings, Bower at his side, and listen to the dispersed chorus. He had not sought wealth or power, only survival. But in his quiet stewardship of the ugliest, noisiest birds in God's creation, he had found all three. The dust from Mr. Corwin's buggy settled. He sat for a long moment, his hands gripping the reins, his gaze fixed on the relentless, purposeful motion of the guinea flock. The sound, that constant kurr-kurr-kurr-kurr, filled the space between them. It was the sound of Abram's victory, and Corwin had finally come to surrender. Abram, he said, his voice low and stripped of all its former arrogance. I was wrong. Abram waited. He knew this was costing the man more than any amount of money. I was a fool, Corwin continued, his eyes still on the birds. I thought a man's will could conquer anything. I thought money could buy solutions. I poured chemicals on my land. I poisoned my own water. And I lost? I lost nearly everything. He finally turned his gaze to meet Abram's. I need to buy some of your birds, he said. It was not a demand, but a plea. The original stock. The ones that started it all. I'll pay whatever you ask. Abram looked from Corwin's desperate face to the flock of birds that had saved him. They were his partners, his army, the strange and noisy heart of his land. He could have named an exorbitant price. He could have refused outright, savoring a final, perfect revenge. But that wasn't his way. Vengeance was a barren crop. He had spent the last 2 years learning to cultivate life, not to salt the earth of his enemies. The price is the same for you as it was for everyone else, Abram said, his voice calm and steady. One healthy calf. Next spring. Corwin stared at him, his expression a mixture of disbelief and profound, humbling gratitude. He had come expecting to be punished, to be made to pay for his pride. Instead, he was being offered a place back in the community, a chance to rebuild on the same terms as everyone else. He nodded slowly. Thank you, Abram, he said, and the words sounded genuine, scraped raw from the depths of his ruin. I accept. As Corwin's buggy retreated down the road, leaving a new, more hopeful plume of dust in its wake, Abram remained on the porch. The sun was beginning to dip below the western hills, painting the sky in strokes of orange and gold. Bao rested his heavy head on Abram's knee. The day's heat was finally breaking. And all around them, the air was filled with the sound. The frantic, rattling, beautiful chatter of 127 doctors, finishing their day's work. It was no longer the sound of folly. It was the sound of wisdom. It was the sound of home.